going through this pile of questions here, and I thank every single member of the audience who has put a question forward. Can I first of all, though, just congratulate Mr. Phil Hoggerty for probably the most amusing one this evening, which is, do we get a lady come round with ice cream at the interval? Mr. Hegarty, thank you for that. Can I suggest you send your proposal into the European Union? I'm sure they'll take it up at our next meeting. But Nigel, I've got a series of questions that were very, very similar common themes with the questions that were put forward. So I've tried to select the questions on that basis, and the first one, from a young gentleman, Mr. Max Jones, age 17. Well done, Max. Nigel, how will leaving the European Union benefit the youth of Britain, specifically those in higher education?
Well, Max, the first thing to say is there has been a substantial amount, frankly, of brainwashing of young people in this country, and the fact that 21 vice-chancellors of our universities came out with very little consultation with their own boards to say we must stay part of the European Union, otherwise all academic and scientific research would grind to a halt, I thought was frankly disgraceful. I think it's even worse, Max, that throughout British universities there are now about 200 Monet professorships. That is, chairs in British universities where they teach history and economics from a European Union perspective, funded by money from the European Commission. So I think some of these attempts to subvert the minds of our young people are wrong. Max, let me tell you what the biggest benefit for you as a 17-year-old and for all young people in this country would be. I thought young people believed in liberty, believed in freedom, and believed in having power over their own lives. You cannot have power over your own life if you're a member of a political union where most of the laws that govern the land are made somewhere else, and over which the British voter at a general election can do nothing to change it. So, Max, the first point is your generation will be better off because they will actually be back in charge of their own destiny. But I think, I could argue to you that economically we don't need this union. We don't need to pay in over £50 million a day. That we'll have a free trade deal because they sell us a lot more motor cars than we sell them. I could make the arguments, as I've just done, that politically we'll be better off governing ourselves and making laws appropriate for our own country. But Max, there's something else. I think we'll be better and prouder and hold our heads higher, and we'll start believing in our country and our people. And when we do that, we'll achieve far more for ourselves and on the world stage too.
Question number 2 from Mr. Gordon Johnson. After we have won the referendum, are we going to have a second referendum foisted on us, as happened in France, the Netherlands and Ireland?
Well, yeah, Gordon. Gordon is basically saying that, I think Gordon said if we vote to leave. What Gordon meant was when we vote to leave. What Gordon really is asking is, will they trust our result? And he's right to ask that, because back in 1992, the Danes in a referendum voted no to the Maastricht Treaty. That should have been the end of the matter, and yet they were forced to vote again. The Irish, twice the Irish have voted against European treaties in the last 15 years, but been forced to vote again in some of the most appalling one-sided electoral contests in terms of money and media coverage that I've ever seen. The French and Dutch voted no in 2005 to the European Constitution, only to be completely ignored as the Constitution was rebranded as the Lisbon Treaty, and nobody ever asked them again. Would I be content for us to win this referendum, have an enormous party, I'm quite looking forward to that bit of it, and then pack our tents and go home, and saying back to you chaps, to hand it back to the very people who frankly betrayed us in the first place? No. Winning this referendum is vital. Without it, we cannot succeed. But I also think we're going to need strong political voices there, providing an electoral threat to make sure they carry out the wishes of the people, and we intend to do exactly that.
Jodie from Eastleigh has asked Nigel, if you were Prime Minister, what would your action plan be in light of the growing security risks to our country? And Jodie, you asked this via Nigel's Facebook page, so well done for interacting with us on that basis.
Terrific, thank you. I'm sure there's a few Facebook questions that have come through. Jodie, wherever you're watching this, look, I think I dealt with a bit of that. The first point about dealing with security is you must be in control of your own borders. You must make sure that you check and log those that come in and go out of your country. The second point about security is being able to defend yourselves effectively. And I have to say, well, I wouldn't let Mr. Corbyn do it, obviously, but he wants to abolish the army, doesn't he? Yeah, and I'm sure any Labour voters here who were wavering as to who they should support, just remember that Mr. Corbyn wants to abolish the army, give the Falkland Islands to Argentina, unilaterally disarm, get rid of the Queen. I don't think he poses a great electoral threat to us, I have to say. But Jodie, the one thing I would say to you is this. I think that what the last government did, and indeed governments before, in terms of slashing the Navy, the Air Force and the Army to a point where we simply could not defend ourselves and increasingly are not being taken seriously on the world stage. I think it is madness not to pay the insurance on your house. You hope there won't be a fire, but if there is a fire, you need to have that cover. And what has been done to our armed forces is an absolute disgrace and threatens our security.
Question 4 from Mr. Frederick Barlow from Chesterfield, long way from home here in Basingstoke. Nigel, when we leave the EU and find it is not as good as we hoped, will there be a returns policy?
Look, Frederick, the whole point about being in control of your own country, about being the master of your own destiny, is I'm quite sure that British governments can make terrible policy mistakes, just as Mr. Juncker and the gang in Brussels can make terrible policy mistakes. But there is a difference. Once something that is proposed by a commissioner becomes a European law, there is nothing that we or all 651 of our MPs can do to change that law. It's European law, it's in the body of European law, there is nothing you can do. If we have a rotten British government that makes a total Horlicks of it, we can at the next general election vote for a new government, kick them out, get rid of the rascals and replace them with somebody else who will undo all of what they did and put in place their manifesto. That is what parliamentary democracy is, and it will give power back to us, the people, and there will be no point in time when I believe going back to Europe will be the right thing to do.
Another question from your Facebook page, Nigel, from Norcan. Nigel, do you think the tragedy in Paris is Merkel's fault for allowing individuals into Europe with no background checks?
Well, look, I'm not going to lay the blame at one individual's door. That would be a mistake. but do I think the policy that the European Union has been pursuing since it implemented its common asylum policy back in April and May of this year, I think the evidence is there. I've said it loudly, clearly and consistently. Yes, Mrs Merkel is a big part of this, but what's clear today is that Mr Juncker and Mr Hollande have learnt nothing from it. We will continue to import terrorism into Europe in the name of being compassionate, and I cannot think of a bigger, better or stronger reason for us to say no in this referendum to protect ourselves from such a folly and such a threat.
From Mr Graham Bentley, when you, Nigel, become our next Prime Minister, how will... Yeah, absolutely, yes. How will you tackle our declining farming and fishing industries to make them thrive like they used to?
Well, I think we need a bit of electoral reform within the United Kingdom to make that a possibility. But anyway, that's perhaps another battle that we fight once we've got back the independence of this country from the European Union. Our fishing and farming industries, well, basically, we've been under foreign rule now for just over 40 years. And our farmers, some will argue that they've done okay out of the European system, others will argue the opposite. What I would say about farming is I think that everything that has been done in the name of the EU has played into the hands of big farmers and giant agribusinesses at the expense of the small and medium-sized family-run farms, and I think there has been a mad rush towards the intensification of agriculture, which personally I do find slightly distasteful. When it comes to fishing, there's a very, very different answer. We, as a result of the common fisheries policy, are only allowed to catch 18% by value of the fish that swim in British territorial waters. 18%. The rest is divvied up amongst our European neighbours, and just to make it worse, we've had for nearly 30 years a quota system whereby in mixed fisheries like the North Sea, we throw back more dead to the bottom of the ocean than we land in our ports. It is complete and utter madness. It has in fishing, it has in processing, it has in boat building, and all the other associated jobs and trades cost many tens of thousands of jobs since 1973. And you only have to look across the other side of the North Sea to Norway. That's the country, by the way, the Prime Minister thinks it would be dreadful for us to be like. Can you imagine life being as bad as it is in Norway, folks, here in Basingstoke? I mean, can you imagine being rich? Wouldn't that be dreadful? Can you imagine being free and democratic? Can you imagine being happy? And can you imagine, getting back to the questioner, being able to catch your own fish? And Norway have 200 miles of the North Sea that is absolutely, exclusively theirs under economic law. They have a thriving fishing industry. If anybody goes to fish in Norwegian waters, they have to pay for the privilege of doing so, or they're impounded by the Norwegian Navy. No mucking about. And they have an environmental policy where it is a criminal offence to throw any single fish back dead into the sea. I want my country back. I want my territorial waters back. I want our fishing industry to be back to what it was years ago.
From Mr. Brian Costa, why is the USA wanting us to remain in the European Union?
Well, there is a bit of history here. I mean, don't forget that the Americans did pay an absolutely massive price in World War II, you know, both in the European theatre and the Pacific theatre, and that after 1945, you know, right up until the end of the 1960s, there were nearly 500,000 American troops on European soil there as our protection and our safety against any potential Soviet threat. So the cost of World War II to the Americans didn't end in 1945, it went on for decades to come. And there were many in the early days of the European project who thought, Well, if Europe all get together and love each other, we won't need to have 500,000 people on American soil. So historically, there was a line of thinking in the USA that said that. Coming more up to date, we have a president in the White House who is the most anti-British president that the United States of America has ever had. His first act on day one was to remove the bust of Winston Churchill, which had been there for decades in the Oval Office. When there was the spill, the unfortunate spill in the Gulf, under BP's umbrella, he couldn't say often enough, could he? British Petroleum. Said it with a degree of venom. Obama is going to do, in the time that he has left, all that he can to keep Britain trapped inside the European Union, and he even put up a lackey that works for him, a trade envoy, Robert Froman, the other week, who said if Britain was outside of the European Union, America would not do a trade deal with Britain. What complete and utter and total baloney. And actually, Obama and his lackeys like Froman are threatening one of the most important strategic and friendly alliances that have existed in the world. And I hope that America gets a better president who understands us more next time round.
From Melita Jeffries, originally from Croatia. Relatively speaking, the European Union is beginning in many ways to resemble Tito's Yugoslavia, the artificial state that collapsed in war. Could the European Union share the same fate as Yugoslavia? And is there a possibility of war in Europe?
Well, the lady said she was from Croatia, which I visited a few times. An incredible place. But of course, the Croat history is a pretty cruel one. The Croats spent something like, and Melita can correct me if I'm wrong, where are you in the audience here? I can't see her. It's a big auditorium. Yeah, hello. I think I'm right in saying, aren't I, that the Croats spent 800 years seeking independence. 800 years seeking an independent Croatia. And then after the fall of communism, they got an independent Croatia, and yet 25 years later, they've surrendered it to the European Union. I have to say that does not make sense to me, but of course their politicians and civil servants have all got very rich as a result of it. I'll leave a number at the end for where to send the lawsuits, okay. What Yugoslavia shows you is that far from it being a project of peace, you cannot put together different countries with different cultures and different languages and different flags and different anthems and identities and histories. You cannot force them into one under a new flag and a new anthem. And don't forget, Yugoslavia was founded to stop war amongst those countries. What they thought in those days was, back in 1920, give them one flag, one police force, one president, they'll be peaceful forever. Well, look how it ended. You can't do it without consent. And that's the point about the European project. It's been done without consent. When the French and Dutch were asked, did they want a constitution for a new superstate? They said no. We would have said no. I've no doubt the Germans and the Danes and the Finns and the Swedes would also have said no. So don't listen to this rubbish that it's brought us 70 years of peace. No, it hasn't. NATO and the nuclear deterrent are what brought us peace since 1945, not Brussels. And far from it being a project that is bringing us all together, actually, I grew up in a Europe that was split from east to west by the Berlin Wall. I'm now going to work every week in a Europe that is divided by a new Berlin Wall. But it goes from north to south, and it's called the Eurozone, where the Mediterranean have been forced into a currency that was never going to work for them. Unless the Greeks become like the Germans, this is never, ever going to work. And you see poverty and mass unemployment and constant bailouts. And actually what I'm seeing are great enmities now growing up in Europe. I don't think, Melita, we're going to see Europe descend into war, but I do think we're going to see Europe descend into political extremism, and at some point, in one of those Mediterranean countries, the people will lose patience with politicians who haven't got the guts to take them out of the euro and to put them back with their own independent currencies. And I'm going to go on. And actually, I spoke more today, obviously, about the horror of Paris and where I think we need to go, perhaps than I normally would at one of these meetings, because we're doing these meetings all over the country. You know, in the course of the last few weeks, I've been in Belfast, and I've been in Gateshead, and I've been, all at Gloucester and Chester, and you name it. And it's my kind of Billy Graham tour of Euroscepticism, you know. But I think, I think the one thing that's worth remembering is if we vote in this referendum and we follow the Prime Minister's advice and we keep things as they are, we're not voting for our relationship with Brussels to stay as it is. We're voting to stay part of an integrationist club. And remember, the people in this country who were saying we should vote that way, apart from the Prime Minister, the leaders of that movement, were the same people who told us 15 years ago that if we didn't join the euro, we'd be ruined. And I'm thinking of Lord Mandelson. All right, I can do better. I can do better than that. Tony Blair. There we are. Thank you. And there's Ken Clarke, who's quite a nice chap, actually. Yeah, difficult to boo. And there's Richard Branson, who's been wrong about everything. And there we are. So actually, and oh, I forgot the CBI. The CBI, who've been wrong about everything forever. And only represent the giant corporates and not the small, struggling, medium-sized men and women entrepreneurs in our society. The point I'm making is you are being sold this argument by people who thought we should join the euro. They were wrong then, and they're wrong now.
Nigel, we have 5 more questions left. This one, though, nice quick one.
I'll be very quick. All right.
Do we close our borders now?
Well, I don't know about close our borders. What we do is we take back control of our borders. That's the point.
With the migrant problem, why are the Arab countries not doing more?
Well, I mentioned Saudi Arabia
From
earlier.
Mr. Tony Bilson.
Yeah, I mentioned Saudi Arabia. But actually, the same goes for Qatar, the same goes for the United Arab Emirates. The 6th wealthiest Arab states have not lifted a finger to help their fellow Muslims in such deep trouble as a result of war and poverty and displacement. I think it's about time Europe said to those countries, isn't it time you gave us something of an example?
From Mr. Kevin Bartlett, why will we have to pay Brussels even if we come out of the European Union?
Well, this again is Mr. Cameron saying, oh yeah, but poor old Norway, they still pay money into the European club. Well, actually what Norway do is they give money to some of the developing countries in Central and Eastern Europe. They don't pay that money directly through Brussels. And Norway and Switzerland are relatively small countries who rely overwhelmingly on their foreign exports on EU markets and who trade with the EU at a massive trade surplus. We are a country of 65 million people. Well, that's the ones we know about, anyway. Now, this is supposed to be a serious meeting. So we are a country of 65 million people. We are now the Eurozone's biggest export market in the world. And they sell us far more than we sell them. They sell us about £50 billion worth of goods, more every year than we sell them. I don't know about us paying a contribution. They should be paying us for the privilege of selling all those motor cars.
The penultimate question, Nigel.
It won't happen, of course.
That's right.
But why should we pay anything to allow access for German motor cars and French wine and all the rest of it? Why don't we just do business with each other? Why don't we just be friendly with each other? Why don't we just act as good neighbours with each other? Why don't we respect each other and our differences? And let's be happy being friends with Europe. But once we're freed from these shackles, let's re-engage with other parts of the world that we turned our backs on. And what a good start it would be to re-engage with the Commonwealth.
The penultimate question, Nigel. One of the old chestnuts here. The argument is always that the NHS would not survive without immigrants, but no one from UKIP, part of the EFDD group, of course, ever counters the argument with the amount of immigrants using the NHS. Could you comment from Mr. Church?
Oh, look, I commented on this during the general election, all right. Crikey. I thought I was going to be chucked in the Tower of London. For daring to suggest that it should be a national health service and not an international health service. And can I say, as somebody who's needed the NHS more than most in my life, with various accidents and disasters that I've been through, and generally been treated pretty well, I must say, that yeah, there are lots of very good foreign nurses and foreign doctors working in the National Health Service, but isn't it a crying pity we're not training enough of our own nurses in our own country?
And your last question, from Mrs. Lambourne. Cameron's renegotiations. Many fear that Mr. Cameron's renegotiations are a charade and that a deal in essence has already been agreed with the Eurocrats on the basis of associate membership model as detailed in the Spinelli Group document and the Five Presidents report. If this is the case, how do you propose to counter Cameron's apparent latest strategy of positioning himself as Mr. Moderate on the centre ground between the Remainers and the Leavers? Well done, Mrs. Lambourne, a very detailed
It's a great question, and yeah. Look, he started off saying we would need fundamental treaty change. He's given up on that. He started off saying we would have to have a debate about the free movement of people. He's given up on that. The only way you would ever get anything in Brussels is to walk into the room carrying a great big stick. This is what the French do. And showing you've got the full intention to jolly well use it if you don't get what you want. He's already thrown the stick away. He's asked for virtually nothing. The only thing he's asked for is a change to migrant benefits, but that will only be doable if he changes benefits for UK workers as well. And anyway, the issue, folks, isn't migrant benefits. The issue is over 600,000 people coming to Britain last year. The number is too big. The number is too unsustainable. The pressure on wages, the health service, the pressure on our primary schools, on our way of life in this country, not to mention the security risk, says that fiddling around with migrant benefits simply isn't enough. Now, on the other stuff that he's asking for, I know what's going to happen. There'll be a lunch. There always is in Brussels. A series of promises will be made, and he'll be given a promissory note. He'll fly back into Britain. They may even reopen Croydon Airport for him. And he'll say, I have in my hand this piece of paper. that promises to amend and update the future European treaties to exclude Britain from the euro. Well, we're not going to join anyway, are we? We're not going to join anyway. And he'll say a great deal has been done, that whilst France and Germany and others wish to push on to a fuller political union, we have now become associate members. Isn't that just the most wonderful package? And what it'll mean is nothing. It'll mean we still have the supremacy of European law. It'll mean we'll go on paying £55 million a day. It means we will go on having a total open border to nearly 500 million people. They may have managed to pull the wool over our eyes collectively 40 years ago. I don't believe they're going to do the same thing again. Thank you very much indeed. All right. You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.